Hi folks, and welcome back to Contract Law. This is the final video in our videos on consideration, and we'll jump back into our Prezi. And we've had a look at consideration, the whys and wherefores. We've looked at the who, we've looked at the what, we've started to look at the when, we've mostly looked at the when, and now we just need to complete our look at the when. Okay, jumping into when. So the last place we left off was third parties, and now what we need to look at is discharge of existing duty in relation to debts. And here we have the rule in Pinnell's case 1602. If a debt is owed to a creditor and the debtor and creditor then agree that the creditor is going to accept a sum less than what was actually owed to that creditor, generally speaking, that will not be binding. The debtor has provided no consideration for the creditor to forego the balance. If it had been supported by other consideration, and this is where we get the lovely reference to a horse, a hawk, or a robe, in addition to the lesser consideration. Or, for example, if the lesser value had been paid earlier than when it was due, so the creditor had had the use of the money for that extra amount of time, that would have also been okay. But as it stood, just a bare agreement that the creditor is going to accept less than what's actually owing to them is not going to be enforceable. That was then applied in the case of Folks and Beer, and that principle's pretty much stood the test of time, but there are a couple of exceptions and caveats that you need to be aware of. The first is deeds of personal insolvency, and they're often just called personal insolvency agreements. These deeds have the force of the Bankruptcy Act behind them, and so the legislation gives force to them. Obviously, because we need to, from a policy sense, help debtors that are in a hopeless situation kind of get out of the bind that they are in.
Holy cow! Somebody's drowning! Oh no, that's not possible. The lagoon is closed.
And in one of these deeds, you have a debtor basically agreeing with all of their relevant creditors to accept a lesser sum in satisfaction, full satisfaction of the debts that are owed to each and every one of them. Now, all the various different creditors agree in this deed that they will accept this lesser sum. Why would they do that? Well, generally speaking, a creditor will agree to this kind of thing if it seems like it's the best way to actually get some money back from the debtor. Oftentimes when a debtor is pushed into a personal insolvency agreement, the only other alternative is going bankrupt. And if they go bankrupt, then for a creditor, it all comes down to whether you're a secured creditor or you're not a secured creditor. Now, if you're not a secured creditor, obviously you're going to be down on the pecking order there, and the trustee in bankruptcy is not going to give you a whole lot of money back on your debt. So if the debtor proposes something like a personal insolvency agreement to you, it's going to be an appealing way for you to get some money back and for them to avoid the whole ramification of bankruptcy. So what happens in one of these deeds is we have this mutual exchange of promises. The debtor says, can you please accept this lesser sum in full satisfaction of my debt? The creditors all say, yes, we will agree to accept this lesser sum. There's a mutual exchange of promises going on, and that's basically the end of the agreement. Everyone signs off, and the creditors get the lesser sum in satisfaction of their debt. They can't then, once that agreement has been signed and sealed, delivered, they can't go back and try and seek full payment later from the debtor. And why is that? Because the rule in Pinnell's case would say, as between a debtor and any particular creditor, payment of a lesser sum is not going to be satisfaction for the full debt. So why would this be binding apart from the fact that it's enshrined in legislation? Well, the general consensus seems to be that it would be a fraud on all of the other creditors for any one particular creditor then to go back and try and seek full payment for their debt. There has been an exchange of promises not just between each particular creditor and the debtor, but the creditors amongst themselves and the debtor. So for one creditor to come back and say, no, actually I want all my money, would be a fraud on the other creditors in that whole mutual exchange of promising that's been going on in one of these deeds. So that's a personal insolvency agreement or a deed of personal insolvency. Have a look at the Bankruptcy Act if you're really interested in that stuff. Finally, the one last thing we need to add is much like in terms of when we were talking about whether or not your performance under an existing contractual duty could be sufficient consideration for a fresh deal, and we found that consideration under an existing contractual duty so far as a third party was concerned would be sufficient consideration for a fresh deal. No questions asked, basically, in that scenario. Similarly, payment by a third party of a lesser sum in full and final satisfaction of a debtor's debt to a creditor is going to be satisfactory consideration here, okay? Even though the debtor pays nothing and the creditor gets less than actually what's due. The creditor can't sue the debtor for the balance after the payment by the third party. Why is that? Much like a personal insolvency agreement, because the creditor has received something that they're not otherwise entitled to, payment by a third party, by another person, and that creditor has effectively promised that other person they wouldn't seek the balance of the debt. Much like the situation of the personal insolvency agreement, basically if they tried to go back and sue the original debtor for the rest of the debt, it would be a fraud on that ultimate third party creditor, and the courts just won't allow that. So that is payment by a third party, and that is discharge of debts, and that is the whole when of consideration. And we finally come to the end of our epic journey into consideration, and I hope that everything has been relatively clear for you. I hope that those thematic questions have been a little bit useful for you. And as I always say, if you have any queries or questions, please let me know. Shoot me an email, send me something on Moodle or Facey. Other than that, I look forward to chatting with you in a Zoom sometime soon. And until then, bye for now. Thanks, guys.